As we've seen, the Enlightenment, modernism, scientific revolution, all of these things were a huge blow to the Roman Catholic Church, and it caused the Roman Catholic Church to start thinking about what went wrong, and also to start thinking about how in the world do we get our power back. So in this lecture, in topic 23, we're going to start talking a lot about the 19th century. We're going to start talking about a lot of the developments after the Enlightenment, and this will bring us into the 20th century and into the 21st century. And we're going to discuss basically how Roman Catholics reacted to the Enlightenment and to modernism, and how they tried to live out the Roman Catholic faith after the Enlightenment. Now, one of the problems that happens whenever you start to discuss modern history, and this would even be true in trying to talk about the 20th century, also trying to talk about the 19th century, that's still part of modern history, it's part of the making of the modern world, is that there hasn't really been enough distance and there hasn't been enough time to look into everything that has happened in the past century or two. New information can come to light, things can change, the reputations of people can change over time. Just to give you an example of this, there are certain American presidents that leave office with very low approval ratings, but years later, historians say what they did was actually great. It was perfect. It was just what the country needed. Or vice versa. A president might leave with very high approval ratings only to find out later that what they did was awful for the country. So you really need a lot of time. You need a lot of time and space to talk about modern history, and particularly modern Catholicism. And in the case of modern Catholicism, we don't have all the information we would like to have. I mentioned this last time with some of the popes during World War II. We don't know everything we need to know about that period of time in order to properly assess, did the Roman Catholic Church do enough for the Jewish people during World War II, the Holocaust, etc. But one thing we do know is that after the Enlightenment, there became this sort of great grassroots devotional movement among lay Catholics and among Catholic clergy. And you could almost see this as kind of the church has decided we're going to circle the wagons. We're going to insulate ourselves. And this is what you just do when your religion, your group, your political group, etc., this is just what you do when you feel like you've been beat up and threatened for a very, very long time, is you circle the wagons and you insulate yourselves. Well, that's good and bad. In fact, the Catholic Church is eventually going to admit in the 20th century at Vatican II, which we'll talk about in our very last lecture, is going to admit we shouldn't have done this, that we should not have closed ourselves off from the modern world for as long as we did. But what happens after the Enlightenment in the 19th century and even on into the 20th century is you start to see this vibrant spirituality among Catholic laity, the members of the church that are sitting there in the pews. And one of the things you see is you see this really pious devotion to Mary, to the Mother of God, which is called Marian piety. Now, there are a couple of things that happen in the 19th century that often surprise cradle Catholics, Catholics that have grown up in the Catholic Church. One of those things is that the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary appears for the first time in the 19th century. Some Catholics think the doctrine of the Assumption goes all the way back to the beginning of the Catholic Church, and it doesn't. What the doctrine of the Assumption is, and it's a very important doctrine in modern Catholicism, it's this belief that Mary, the Mother of God, the Mother of Jesus, never died. Just like Jesus was assumed into heaven, he speaks to his disciples in the book of Acts, the second volume to the Gospel of Luke. He ascends up into heaven he's assumed, he has his assumption up into heaven. He doesn't die after he's resurrected. The thought for a long time in the Catholic Church had been that Mary is so special because she's the Queen of Heaven, that she too was assumed up into heaven. And if you have God sitting on the throne, Jesus sitting at his right hand, then you have Mary sitting at the left hand of God. But that whole doctrine of the Assumption becomes dogmatic. It becomes doctrine only in the 1800s. And this is at a period of time when the church is reacting to the Enlightenment and to modernism. In fact, Mary's husband, Joseph, the carpenter, Joseph of Nazareth, he, during this time, becomes a universal saint, and he becomes a hero, and there's sort of this rediscovery of Jesus's earthly father, Joseph, who in many respects wasn't all that important throughout church history until you get into the 19th century. And then you start to see things like May becoming the month of Mary. And so you'll see these things called May crownings. If you're driving around, say, in the suburbs, and you see a statue of Mary in the month of May, and she has some sort of crown made of flowers or what have you on top of her head, or if you see Mary in a Catholic Mass during the month of May being crowned, this is because during this period of time in the 19th century, Mary became so important. She became more important really than she ever had been, and so this whole month of May is devoted to her, and she's crowned and all that sort of stuff. And then you had people starting to pray to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. In fact, you can go to a Catholic bookstore today and you can buy a statue that shows the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and there's certain prayers that you pray along with that statue. There's also a similar statue with the heart of Jesus, and all of that. So what really happened at the end of the 19th century, or through the 19th century, I should say, is that the response of the Catholic laity was to kind of double down on this Marian piety, because this is really what makes us different as Catholics from the modern world and from Protestant Christians, is our devotion to Mary. And in fact, this is a period of time when you started to see a lot of Catholics wearing these medals with certain depictions of certain saints or depictions of the Mother of God, as we see in this case here. You will still see Catholics doing that down to this day. You'll certainly see Catholics around here at Albertus Magnus College doing that. It's hard for us to think about this, but Catholicism, especially in the United States, remember, hasn't been accepted yet as sort of a mainstream Christian religion. People often forget that if you go back 50, 60 years in our history to something like the President Kennedy, there was so much fear, especially among Protestant Christian Americans, about having a Roman Catholic president. We may not think anything is all that odd about that today, because Mitt Romney was a Mormon and ran for president against Barack Obama. But this is a very strange, interesting time for the Catholic Church through the 19th century and on through a large part of the 20th century. Well, sermons after the Enlightenment changed as well. So did the process of catechesis change. The main theme, the major theme of most Roman Catholic sermons in the 1800s on into the first part of the 20th century focused on obedience to the church, obedience to the Pope, obedience to God. A lot of the sermons and a lot of the catechesis had to do with devotion to Mary and obedience to things like saying prayers to Mary, saying novenas to Mary, and even more emphasis was placed on saying the Rosary. Now, the Rosary had been around for a very, very long time in the Roman Catholic Church, and its roots in many respects go back to St. Dominic, the founder of the Dominicans. But the importance that Catholics place on praying the Rosary today, in which if you're not Catholic, you have all these beads and you have these different cycles you go through with the Rosary. You basically, from each section to each section of the Rosary, this is where you say, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus, and you keep repeating it, and then finally you hit a certain section of the beads where you say the Our Father and a few other things. But this sort of modern devotion to the Rosary that still exists in the Catholic Church today comes out of the Enlightenment. Now, as I said, the Rosary has been around for a long time. In fact, it became very, very important during the Battle of Lepanto in 1572, when Catholics were fighting Turks off the Greek coast. Pius V as you can see, 1566 to 1572, has a vision where he sees Mary's hand, and this leads to the Holy Rosary Feast. So the Rosary has been around for a really long time, but after the Enlightenment, it becomes even more important. It sort of becomes an everyday part of Roman Catholic life. And in fact, the Rosary, again, this is something that Catholics realize makes them different from Protestants. As we have these rosary beads, we have a devotion to Mary, to the Mother of God. And the Rosary is all about a devotion to the Mother of God. And then there's all these appearances throughout the world in the 19th and 20th centuries of Mary that just become these monumental events in the history of Roman Catholicism. In Mexico, in Guadalupe, there's an appearance of Mary, and there Mary becomes the Mother of Guadalupe, Mary of Guadalupe. In France, there's two appearances, La Salette and at Lourdes. In Ireland, there's an appearance of Mary at Knock. Portugal, the famous Fatima appearance. And then in the United States, there's a grotto at the University of Notre Dame where there was an appearance of Mary. And this is the type of thing that's going on after the Enlightenment, is a lot of stock is placed in these appearances, and people will go to these places today, even and make pilgrimages there, to be on holy ground where Mary had appeared. And in fact, the Roman Catholic Church took this as a sign that God had not given up on the Roman Catholic Church, that the compassion of the Mother of God is coming through here. And this is a reminder to the faithful of stay the course, that God is still with the Catholic Church. So as you can see, lots of stuff about Mary after the Enlightenment. And it's sort of after being beat up for a while. The Roman Catholic Church, in a sense, runs to Mom. It runs to Mary and looks for her comfort and looks for her compassion. Papal leadership is fascinating during this period of time in the 19th century, and it too focuses on Mary and Marian piety and Marian doctrines. In 1854, Pius IX defines the Immaculate Conception. This is a very important dogmatic thing today in the Roman Catholic Church. A lot of Catholics are unaware of the fact that the Immaculate Conception doesn't become dogma until the 19th century. A lot of Protestants confuse the Immaculate Conception with the virgin birth. They are two totally different things. The Immaculate Conception has to do with the birth of Mary. If Jesus is born without sin, there was a belief throughout Catholic history that it was possible that his mother was also born without sin, making her different, unique. Even though the Catholic Church had talked about this for a long time, it doesn't become official dogma until Pius IX makes it that way in 1854. Leo XIII writes 11 documents on the Rosary. Pius XII consecrates the world in 1942 during World War II to Mary's Immaculate Conception. 1945 becomes the Marian year. The Assumption is further defined in 1950, and in fact, a very recent Pope John Paul II increased devotion to Mary, personal devotion to Mary, by changing a couple things in the Rosary, and also when there was an assassination attempt on his life that he survived, John Paul II claims that during that whole process, when he thought he might die, the Mother of God visited him and told him certain things, told him he would live, etc., etc. So because he lived, he felt that he needed to tell members of the Catholic Church of, look, you need to be more and more devoted to the Mother of God. You need to revere her more and more. She needs to be more central in our lives and in our faith, etc., if you're Catholic. So that is one major response to the Enlightenment, is circle the wagons, focus on what makes us different. What makes us different as Catholics compared to all the other Protestants is the Mother of God. And as you can see, there are a lot of things about Mary that become important, dogmatic things in the 19th century. And this, of course, keeps going on into the early part, the first half of the 20th century. So the response in the 19th century and the early 20th century is focus on the Mother of God. But at the same time, something also appears at the end of the 19th century known as Catholic social teaching. This is sadly one of the most misunderstood things in the Roman Catholic Church. It is also something most Catholics are unaware of and something most Catholics never read. In fact, there is a book titled Roman Catholic Social Teaching, Our Best Kept Secret. Catholic social teaching is, when it comes about at the end of the 19th century, it is a response to the abuses of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Pope Leo XIII is really the father of Roman Catholic social teaching. In 1891, he writes a text called Rerum Novarum, known as On the Condition of Labor, in which he, as a pope, speaks out for the rights of workers in factories in Europe. And basically what he says is the church is on the side of the workers. In fact, one of the really fun experiments to do if you ever take Catholic social teaching here at Albertus Magnus is to read Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, read Karl Marx's A Communist Manifesto, and then read Rerum Novarum. And what you find out really quickly is these three texts, Christmas Carol, A Communist Manifesto, and Rerum Novarum, are all kind of approaching the question of the Industrial Revolution with very similar solutions. That workers are being abused, that factory owners are not being fair in the wages they're paying workers. Remember, at the end of the 19th century, you don't have OSHA, you don't have workman's comp, you don't have any of this, you don't have child labor laws. And Leo XIII, I mean, this is astounding because the church is insulating itself, but he decides as Pope to speak out on social issues and to critique working conditions in Europe. He starts talking about the need for fair and living wages for workers, the need for good working conditions, respect for family life. In fact, he starts talking about the need for the government to intervene and to provide aid to working families. And this trend of Catholic social teaching is going to occur all the way down to the 21st century. In fact, the very last social encyclical was written by Pope Francis, and it was all about the importance of Catholics taking care of the environment. And people are often shocked when they read Catholic social teaching because Catholic social teaching seems really liberal. A lot of times people think all the Catholic Church talks about as being against abortion and against gay marriage, and then they read Catholic social teaching and start to see this whole other side of the Catholic Church that a lot of Catholics themselves know nothing about. In fact, Catholic social teaching down to this day has created groups like Catholic Action, the Catholic Worker Movement started by Dorothy Day in New York. I'll show you a picture of her in a moment. These groups that decided we are going to try to live out as Catholics the principles of Catholic social teaching. In many respects, what Catholic social teaching did, starting with Leo and then all the other popes after him, is it introduced an activist faith that was focused on service and issues of fairness and justice in the marketplace and social settings. It is, and this is surprising to some people, it is as critical of Marxism and socialism as it is of capitalism. Oftentimes, Catholics in the United States think that Catholicism is 100% completely compatible with American styles of capitalism. If you read Catholic social teaching, you realize there's a caveat to that. And even someone like Pope John Paul II said capitalism is fine as long as it is regulated, highly regulated capitalism. And Catholic social teaching led to this new kind of theology that came out of Latin American Catholicism known as liberation theology in the 1960s and 1970s, in which suddenly Jesus was rethought as an individual that wasn't just trying to free people from guilt and sin, but as a true liberator who comes along and tries to liberate you from dictatorships, liberate you from poverty and oppressive economic systems. So this, while the church is insulating itself, this is going on too. And a lot of this is going to be why the church, which we'll see in our final lecture, finally does open up to the world and rethink itself in the 1960s. Here's an image of Dorothy Day and the Catholic, one of the founders, along with Peter Moran, of the Catholic worker movement. And you can certainly read numerous biographies about her, read her own autobiographies. It's an absolutely fascinating woman that decided, what would it look like if I took the church's social teaching seriously? And this led her to protest various wars in the 20th century, to live among the poor, to work with the poor, etc. The other big thing that happened after the 19th century, in the 19th century and afterwards, was that the liturgy of the church was on its way to being reformed and was being reformed. In the Catholic Church, if you ever step into a Catholic church, if you're not Catholic or if you are Catholic, you know this. You know these prayers that you got out of a prayer book. The Mass is written out for you. And now, if you've gone to a Catholic church most of your life, you don't look at this stuff anymore. You don't look at the bulletin or the prayer book. You've memorized a lot of this. But the idea of liturgy, the idea of that type of worship, is that everyone is actively participating in the worship service together. They're saying the same things. They're doing the same things. But what's going to happen is, for a long time, the laity simply just observed a Catholic Mass. In fact, the way one scholar put it is, what's going to happen with Catholic worship after the Enlightenment is it's going to go from the Baroque theaters of salvation, laity as witness, to the modern recovery of ancient participation. If you were, prior to Vatican II, even in the United States, to go to a Catholic Mass, you may have no idea what's going on. It would be in Latin. You would wonder, why does the priest not even face us during the Eucharist? And you would feel very much like you're not a part of this, that you're watching this theatrical play occur before your eyes. Well, in the 18th century, there were these grassroots movements. There was a clerical movement to start explaining these Latin prayers to the laity and to start having some readings in the vernacular. So if you were in England, you would get explanations, obviously, in English. If you were in France, you would start getting prayers and some explanations in French. This will eventually lead to a major liturgical reform in the 20th century at Vatican II. We will talk about that next time, but just realize that in the 18th, 19th centuries, this is already starting to happen. That many Catholics are thinking, we don't want to just witness the Eucharist anymore. We want to be participants when we go to Mass. In the 19th century, scholarship started looking well back into the church's rich liturgical past, into the great traditions of the church, and started looking at, okay, what were some of the earliest liturgies that we can recover from the church fathers, from the medieval period, even from the New Testament. Instrumental in this was Pius X, who in 1903 wrote Tra le Solecitudini, and what all of this produced was congregational singing and frequent daily reception of the Eucharist. You don't see this as much anymore in the Catholic Church. A lot of Catholics only go to Mass once a week, if that, but there was a period of time in the 19th century and through a large part of the 20th century where Catholics felt the obligation to go to Mass every single day. The real change comes in 1963, which we'll talk about next time with Vatican II's text Sacro Sanctum Concilium. But before that, there were already a flurry of changes being put into place. So the way that Catholics had been worshiping since the medieval period really began to change after the Enlightenment. And again, at Vatican II, it will all change, but we will talk about that in our next lecture. So the important things to recognize is that after the Enlightenment, the church insulated itself and turned to Mary. There was a lot of pious devotion to Mary among the laity and among the clergy. The Catholic Church also started talking about social issues and started forming texts that would define Catholic social justice all the way down to this day, starting with Leo XIII. And these liturgical reforms started to happen within the church, which lead us up to the modern period and to Vatican II.